Jeffrey Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. From the outset, his childhood was marked by dysfunction and instability within his family. His mother, Joyce, struggled with severe mental health challenges, including anxiety and depression, which often left her emotionally unavailable and volatile. Meanwhile, his father, Lionel, was frequently absent due to work commitments and later admitted to being unaware of many of the troubling signs in Jeffrey's early years. This lack of parental attention and emotional support created an environment where Jeffrey became increasingly withdrawn and isolated. He struggled to form meaningful connections with his peers and showed early signs of troubling behavior. One of the most alarming aspects of his childhood was his fascination with dead animals. Initially, this interest seemed harmless, starting with collecting insects and small creatures. However, it quickly escalated to more disturbing activities, such as dissecting roadkill and preserving the remains. He appeared to be captivated by the anatomy and decay of these animals, an obsession that hinted at deeper psychological issues. Despite these warning signs, Jeffrey's behavior often went unnoticed or was dismissed by those around him. His parents' turbulent relationship culminated in a bitter divorce when he was a teenager, further exacerbating his feelings of abandonment and alienation. These formative experiences and unchecked tendencies laid the groundwork for the dark path he would eventually take. Growing up in the quiet suburbs of Ohio, Mark was the kind of boy who blended in with the scenery, neither excelling in academics nor standing out in sports. He was just there, an unassuming presence who rarely drew attention. But behind his unremarkable exterior, Mark was harboring secrets that even he struggled to understand. As a child, Mark displayed a strange fascination with the world around him, particularly with how things worked on the inside. At first, it was mechanical toys, disassembling them to see their inner workings. But as he grew older, his curiosity turned towards biology. He would pore over anatomy books from the library, spending hours studying the detailed illustrations of muscles and organs. His interest might have been dismissed as the budding passion of a future doctor, but there was something unsettling about the intensity of his focus. During his teenage years, Mark's world shifted in ways that he couldn't fully articulate. He discovered something about himself that he instinctively knew he couldn't share: his attraction to other boys. In the 1980s Midwest, being gay wasn't something easily accepted, and Mark learned to keep this truth hidden. His family, devout and conservative, would never understand, so he buried it. Yet the suppression of his identity began to twist within him. His attraction wasn't just physical, it became tangled with darker fantasies. Mark found himself drawn to the idea of dominance and control, imagining scenarios where he had absolute power over submissive partners. These fantasies weren't fleeting, they took root, growing more vivid as the years went on. By the time Mark reached adulthood, the signs of disturbance had long been present, though few would have noticed. His quiet demeanor and unassuming nature masked the complexity and the darkness brewing inside him. The first murder. It was the summer of 1978, and Jason Miller had just turned 18. For most people, it was the season of freedom, the first taste of adulthood. But for Jason, it was the season his life would take a turn into darkness. Driving through the back roads near his small town, Jason noticed a lone figure walking along the shoulder. The man, a hitchhiker named Sam, looked to be in his early 20s. Jason slowed down, the engine of his old Chevy rumbling as he leaned across the passenger seat. "Need a ride?" Jason asked. Sam smiled, grateful for the offer. "Yeah, man. Headed towards Madison if that's on your way." Jason nodded. "Sure, hop in." The drive started off friendly, filled with small talk about the weather, music, and the hitchhiker's vague plans to visit a friend. But as they drove deeper into the wooded outskirts, Jason's mind began to wander. He didn't want Sam to leave. The thought of being alone again, of returning to the emptiness of his life, gnawed at him. They ended up at Jason's house, a secluded property surrounded by trees. He offered Sam a beer, which the hitchhiker accepted without suspicion, but Jason's intentions were far from innocent. As the evening wore on, the atmosphere shifted, a confrontation ensued, and in a sudden burst of violence, Jason killed Sam. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. The blood, the stillness, it was overwhelming. But instead of panic, Jason felt something else, a strange sense of calm. Methodically, he dismembered the body, hiding the evidence with a chilling precision that surprised even him. Escalation of crimes. The murder might have been the first, but it was far from the last. Jason tried to carry on as if nothing had happened, enrolling in college that fall, but he couldn't keep up with his studies. Alcohol had become his constant companion, dulling the edges of his thoughts and the weight of his actions. By the end of his first semester, he dropped out, retreating into a spiral of self-destruction. A brief stint in the army followed, but Jason's drinking got him discharged. With nowhere else to turn, he moved in with his grandmother. She welcomed him with open arms, unaware of the darkness he carried. Her quiet religious life was a stark contrast to Jason's growing inner turmoil. While living with her, Jason discovered Milwaukee's underground gay scene. He began frequenting bars and clubs, drawn to the freedom they offered. But his visits were anything but innocent. Jason used charm and alcohol to lure men back to his room. There he would drug them, ensuring they were completely at his mercy. For some, the night ended with Jason fulfilling his twisted fantasies of control. For others, it ended in death. Jason became adept at hiding his crimes. His grandmother, a devout woman with a sharp eye for cleanliness, occasionally noticed strange odors or items that didn't belong. But Jason always had an explanation, and she never pressed further. As the years went on, his crimes escalated, each one more brutal than the last. Yet, in the eyes of the world, Jason remained an unremarkable man, a quiet, reserved figure who blended into the background. Methods and motives. By the late 1980s, Jason Miller had honed his methods with chilling precision. Each step was carefully planned, executed with the detached demeanor of someone performing a routine task. To the world outside, he remained unremarkable, a man who lived in the shadows. But within the confines of his room, Jason's life unfolded in ways that were both horrific and calculated. His method always began the same way. Jason would frequent Milwaukee's gay bars, blending into the vibrant crowds. He was quiet, never the center of attention, but his reserved nature had a way of drawing people in. He offered drinks and easy conversation, disarming potential victims with his boy-next-door demeanor. Once he earned their trust, Jason would suggest heading back to his place, usually with the promise of another drink or a place to crash for the night. By the time his victims arrived, his plan was already in motion. Jason's weapon of choice was subtle but effective: sleeping pills. He'd crush them into powder, mixing them into drinks with practiced ease. Within minutes, his guests would begin to feel the effects, their movements slowing, their speech slurring. Jason watched with a clinical detachment as they succumbed to unconsciousness. It was during these moments, when his victims lay helpless before him, that Jason felt most in control. This, he realized, was the root of his compulsion, the need to dominate, to possess. He'd take out his Polaroid camera, carefully arranging the unconscious bodies into suggestive poses before snapping photo after photo. The images weren't just souvenirs, they were trophies, evidence of his power over them. For Jason, these trophies weren't just physical objects, they were symbols of his control. They allowed him to relive his crimes, to feel that rush of dominance long after his victims were gone. Yet beneath the cold, calculated surface, Jason's motives were rooted in something deeply broken. His compulsion for control was a twisted response to a life where he'd always felt powerless, powerless to express his true self, powerless to escape the loneliness that had haunted him since childhood. Each victim was an attempt to fill that void, to assert control over a world that had left him feeling invisible. But no matter how many trophies he collected, no matter how many photos he took, the void remained. And so the cycle continued, an endless loop of violence, domination, and despair. By the early 1990s, Jason Miller's killing spree had gone on for years, each murder more brazen than the last. But despite the mounting evidence of his crimes, there were moments, critical moments, where those around him could have intervened. Had anyone been more vigilant, had the authorities done their job, perhaps the horrors that followed could have been prevented. Jason's neighborhood was quiet, the kind of suburban area where neighbors rarely spoke to each other unless it was over a fence or at the mailbox. But even in such an environment, there were signs that something wasn't right at Jason's house. For weeks, residents near his home noticed a foul odor wafting from his property. It was a scent that couldn't be ignored, a mixture of decay and rot. Some neighbours, curious but hesitant to get involved, assumed it was just a problem with a dead animal. But others were more concerned. They saw strange people coming and going at odd hours, some of them looking disoriented or even stumbling as they left Jason's house. The comings and goings, coupled with the pervasive smell, raised eyebrows, yet no one thought to call the police. Perhaps they didn't want to make waves in a neighbourhood that prided itself on being safe and peaceful. Or perhaps they just didn't know how to connect the dots. And then there were the police. On one occasion, in 1991, a young man named Tracy Edwards managed to escape from Jason's house. Bloodied, disoriented and terrified, Edwards ran to a nearby police station seeking refuge. He was the lucky one, having survived the horrific ordeal. When he told the officers what had happened to him at Jason's hands, they initially appeared concerned. But when Edwards mentioned the word domestic dispute, the officers seemed to lose interest. It was a series of missed opportunities, subtle hints, strange smells, and desperate cries for help that allowed Jason to continue for so long. The negligence of those around him, coupled with the failure of law enforcement to listen to the victims, had created an environment where Jason's crimes could thrive in the shadows. It wasn't supposed to end like this. Jason Miller had been careful, meticulous even, in covering his tracks. The victims who had come and gone from his life were little more than nameless faces to most, and his carefully hidden collection of trophies, Polaroids, body parts, seemed to assure him that no one would ever know the horrors that had taken place within the walls of his apartment. But in 1991, his reign of terror came to an abrupt and unexpected end. Tracy Edwards, the young man who had managed to escape Jason's clutches earlier that year, had managed to break free once more. Bloodied, bruised, and desperate, he ran to a nearby police station. His body was marked with the unmistakable signs of abuse. This time, he was determined not to be ignored. He told the officers everything about the chains, the dismemberment, the drugs, and the terror he had endured. The police, who had failed to act when Edwards first arrived at the station, were now more alert. They took him seriously, and his story led them directly to Jason's apartment. When officers arrived at the building, they were still skeptical. After all, it seemed unlikely that a man who had been so careful in his actions could leave behind evidence so damning. But as they entered the apartment, they were confronted with an overwhelming scene, one that shattered the false sense of normalcy Jason had so carefully maintained. The arrest of Jason Miller sent shockwaves through the community. What had seemed like an unremarkable man with a quiet life was revealed to be a sadistic killer, responsible for the deaths of at least 17 men over the course of a decade. His crimes were meticulous, calculated, and devastating. Each victim had been treated not as a person, but as an object, a trophy to add to his collection. But it wasn't just Jason's actions that came under scrutiny. The investigation and the events leading up to his capture highlighted a series of systemic failures that allowed his crimes to continue for so long. The police mishandling of Tracy Edwards' initial escape was a glaring example of how Jason had been able to continue his killing spree. The officers had dismissed Edwards' claims, believing the situation to be a domestic dispute, rather than investigating the disturbing signs that pointed to something far darker. Furthermore, societal biases played a role in allowing Jason to remain unchecked for so long. Many of his victims were marginalized individuals, gay men, many of whom were estranged from their families or lived on the fringes of society. Their disappearances, while tragic, were often overlooked. The case prompted widespread public outrage, as people realized that Jason's ability to evade capture for so long was a direct result of systemic failures within law enforcement and the societal neglect of certain communities. His victims had been treated as disposable, their lives deemed less valuable simply because of their sexual orientation or social status. Jason's capture did not end the pain, but it did force a reckoning. Families, friends, and communities were left to grapple with the loss of their loved ones, while the criminal justice system was forced to confront the mistakes that had allowed his crimes to continue. For Jason, however, the capture was just the beginning of his own unravelling. His trial would become a media sensation, and the true extent of his crimes would be laid bare for the world to see. But as he sat in his prison cell, Jason's mind remained as cold and detached as it had been throughout the years, unmoved by the lives he had destroyed, unmoved by the suffering he had caused. His legacy would live on not only in the memories of his victims, but in the wake of a system that failed to protect them. Jason Miller's case is a stark reminder of how the darkest elements of human nature can remain hidden behind the most ordinary facades. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that evil can often be overlooked, ignored, or dismissed when systemic failures and societal biases are at play. In his case, the failure to see his victims as people, individuals with lives and stories, reveals a deep-seated disregard for those on the margins of society. The investigation and its aftermath expose a critical lesson: the importance of listening, not just to the victims, but also to the communities often pushed to the edges. It's easy to overlook the vulnerable, especially when they are marginalized, but such oversight has devastating consequences. The public outrage that followed Jason's capture was not just about his crimes, but about the realization that justice had been denied for so long. Perhaps the most profound lesson is the need for systemic change. No one should be made to feel invisible, and no community should be neglected. Justice is only possible when we acknowledge the humanity in all people, and when we hold systems accountable for their failures. The pain and suffering of Jason's victims were not in vain, but the lessons we take from their tragic stories can shape a better, more compassionate future.